One of the best ways you can support the Bridgeton Beacon is to go to the Bridgeton Beacon YouTube channel and hit subscribe. When you hit subscribe, we're going to need you to also click the little bell icon so that you actually get alerts when we post new episodes. But this is a great way for you to support the Bridgeton Beacon in lieu of an actual donation or monetary support.
Welcome back to the Bridgeton Beacon. I have the privilege and honor on this chilly but sunny Sunday morning to have been invited into the beautiful home of Dr. Flavia Alaya and her husband Sandy Fedema. Dr. Alaya is a founder and acting director of Chaba, the Center for Historic American Building Arts. And we're going to speak about how and why she founded Chaba and why historic preservation, and specifically people-centered historic preservation, is so important to Bridgeton. Dr. Alaya, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thank you for having me into your home. I mentioned a couple minutes ago that I grew up right around the corner from this beautiful home, and it brings back a lot of memories to be back in this neighborhood. So thank you for having this time with me today. So you, as I mentioned, founder, acting director of Chaba, and you landed in Bridgeton in 2006, PhD in literature and history, cultural studies, and critical theory and analysis from Columbia University. You were inspired into housing and preservation activism on New York's West Side during the urban renewal phase. You were a founding faculty member at Ramapo College, still involved, I believe, in Paterson, New Jersey. And the list goes on and on. But you landed in Bridgeton in 2006 and thereafter got involved and founded Chaba. Can you tell me how you came to come to our wonderful town of Bridgeton?
Well, it's a long story, but I'll try to abbreviate it because it's, I left crumbs, if I say. So the transition from the West Side to New Jersey was relatively easy. I was still teaching in New York, but it was cheaper to live in New Jersey than in New York. And I was beginning to raise a family. I was teaching at NYU uptown at the time. And so I started the family in Ridgefield, New Jersey. And then when my husband and I were able to we thought we were able to afford to buy a house, and we continued to scope out northern New Jersey for possibilities. And we would sort of look in the boonies, go up into Sussex County or into northern Bergen County, northern Passaic County. But every time we would travel that way, we would pass through Paterson. And we both sort of looked at each other and said, God, this looks like it's an interesting place. So we decided to scope out what was available in Paterson at the time. And it was during the period of white flight. So homes were very inexpensive, actually, because a lot of people were leaving. And we managed to find a nice big old house on the east side in Paterson and raise the family there. So, of course, my husband was an historian. I'm a sort of cultural historian. So the interest in Paterson became the sort of launching pad for local history, what my late husband used to call scripting the landscape. And we sort of interacted on that basis to find out what was the backstory of Paterson, which turns out to have been luminously interesting. I mean, I can't tell you. And I'm still interested in Paterson history, and I'm still working on Paterson history. In fact, I'm part of a National Council on Public History project on Paterson history. So it happens to be African American history, but it sort of integrates with the labor history of Paterson, which is a very strong focus of mine. I don't know whether you know that the 1913 silk strike that occurred in Paterson, is still considered one of the sort of landmark labor events in American history. So that sort of historical background of Paterson sort of launched my public career as a public historian. I became the head of the Passaic County Historical Society. I launched several projects during that time that scripted the landscape, as I continued to put it, and reminded people of what was important to remember in the local history. And my late husband, who was a labor historian, used to remind us that all history is local, that it's happened somewhere. And so you can always trace it back to its roots in its local setting. So that's really what I was doing national history on a local basis. And I eventually became chair of the new Historic Preservation Commission in Paterson when the labor history and that kind of industrial history of Paterson became sort of a national exercise in historicizing local communities. And I was part of a local history initiative. I became chair of the Paterson Historic Preservation Commission, as I said, and was a local activist. On the commission happened to be an architect who eventually was drawn to work here in Bridgeton. And I'll make that a short story because it's a longer story, but she was drawn to Bridgeton by a historic preservation firm here in Bridgeton. I think that you know probably that historic preservation was a big thing here in Bridgeton, the largest historic district in the state. And once she moved down here, kept in touch with me and said, I think this is an interesting place. You thinking about moving? My kids were all grown up. The house was too big. We were thinking of moving. And so Sandy and I was remarried by that time. And Sandy and I scoped a place out and said, oh my God, this is perfect.
House we're in right now?
Well, the town itself was perfect. It was just the right mix of things for him and for me. And then when this house chanced to be available, we kind of moved on it as quickly as we could. So that's the backstory. That's Maria Moreno. She is still working as an architectural consultant and has worked for Penny Watson and Watson and Henry. So it was that firm, Watson and Henry, that used to be located here in Bridgeton. That was a very famous firm. Actually, Michael Henry and I were both representatives for New Jersey on the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And that's how we got to know each other well. And so the impact of the relationship that we had with Michael extended to Maria. And she, as I said, moved down to Bridgeton and told us that it was a place to look at when we were thinking about moving out of our big old house in Paterson. So this seems like a big old house too, but it's smaller actually than the one we had. It was gigantic, and it was great for raising 3 kids. The 2 boys had the whole top floor, and my daughter had a big old bedroom overlooking the city, basically. There was a big parking lot next door, so she had an expansive view of town.
Was it hard to leave that home?
Oh my God, it was. Mm-hmm. And I still, the times we spent there, it was really, really a very impressive, marking part of my life. As I say, I still work on Paterson history because Paterson is sort of endlessly historically interesting. And that investment in Paterson has continued to pay off 10-fold, 100-fold. And my children still feel tremendously attached to it. They, of course, associate it with their late father, who was, as I said, also a labor historian and left his own mark on the universe of history in Paterson. So, yeah, it's still like our soul city, you might say.
Sure, but it sounds like you embrace where you are. And so when you moved
That's exactly
to Bridgeton,
right.
Within a very short period of time, you were the founder or one of the founders, you can correct me, of Chaba. So the Center for Historic American Building Arts.
Right. I had always wanted to start an historic preservation organization in Paterson. I was on the Paterson Historic Preservation Commission, but that wasn't the same thing. That was sort of an official board. And I wanted to start a community-based organization. And that hadn't happened. 2001 happened. All kinds of disruptions to our community life happened at the turn of the century. As you know, Paterson was really a center for anti-Muslim activism at that time because of the 2001 events. So it was very, very wrought time. And when we had already decided that we were going to move on because we had this big old house and it was not productive for us physically or financially to stay there. So when Michael Henry and Maria Moreno recommended that we look at Bridgeton, it was like love at first sight. And we happened on this house during our just search through the community to see what it looked like. And this one happened to be for sale at the moment. So that was like a like star-studded moment. Like it was planned for us to be here. As I said, I always had wanted to start a preservation organization, and this city, which has the largest historic district in the state, seemed like the perfect place to start an historic preservation organization that was ground-based, that was community-based, not necessarily official. It so happened that because of my interest in historic preservation, the then mayor at the time appointed me to the Historic District Commission here in Bridgeton. And so I got my sea legs, you might say, working within the governmental structure, the Preservation Commission here in Bridgeton, or the District Commission as it's called. And so began to interact with officialdom and began to see that there was a very stressed relationship between the official city government and the historic district. I tried to manipulate my role on the Historic District Commission to encourage the city to invest more in its historic district, to utilize statewide monies that were available for historic district and so on, to organize them into activism on their own, on the city's own. But they were very tentative about it. And I think it was probably when I was fired from the Historic District Commission because I was maybe too zealous. Mayor Kelly thought that I was not in line with his own perspective on the future of Bridgeton, that I decided that it was time to launch a community-based organization.
It's probably not the first time you've dealt with competing interests.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, of course. It's so interesting because the Bridgeton has a presence as the largest historic district in the state. It has an official historic district commission. It has all the infrastructure that should support an historic district. But it was very, you might say, conflicted about the community development as a historic district and saw community development as the enemy of historic district. I think there was a racial element there too, and I don't think that we can exclude that as a factor in historic districts. I had experienced it in Patterson as well until we generated support for Hinchliffe Stadium, which had been a black baseball site. The community there didn't feel like they trusted historic preservation to be favorable to the history of the community as a mixed community. I was also a activist in the survival of an Underground Railroad site and worked with the black community there in Patterson to save that site. And now it is a nationally registered, not just nationally registered, but it's on the National Underground Railroad program under the head of the National Park Service. So I had all the right credentials for interacting with a community that was becoming very mixed, but I still, because I was new, I was not a familiar name or a familiar activist in the community. I think there was a level of mistrust in Bridgeton about that. So although I was appointed to the district commission, I was disappointed from the commission shortly after Mayor Kelly became mayor. And because there was this tension between the officialdom and the historic preservation community, I thought that it was timely to start a nonprofit organization and to make sure that it was as reflective of the community in all of its aspects as possible. So that's where the Bridgeton Center for Historic and Building Arts comes in. I was already working with Maria Moreno, who is an architect, so the architectural aspect of the district was featured, and we really focused on starting with the architecture and then moving into the community history.
You said something I want to ask you about, and I didn't realize this, that Bridgeton has the largest historical district in the state of New Jersey.
That's right.
I did not know that.
Is that a...
Yeah, I did not know that. So can you explain that to me? You're a member of the Historic Sites Council, correct?
That's correct.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how, when you say that Bridgeton has the largest historic district
in the state of New Jersey?
What does that mean?
Okay, it means let's just go back for a minute to the Historic Sites Council. The Historic Sites Council is a statewide actual official board that reviews threats to registered historic properties, that properties that are on the National Register. So I've had that official position since the turn of the century, basically, before I came to Bridgeton. When I was in Patterson. So, and I've just succeeded in holding on to it because there is a tension between preservation and state government very often. State governments, especially progressive mayors and governors, want to develop. They want community development. They want to see new building go on. They want to see investment. They think that historic preservation can be retrograde. It can hold investment back. So there is that tension always between what we do and what the civil society seems to think they want. One of the elements of my activism is that to demonstrate that development and historic preservation can go together. And the founding of Chaba is basically clarifying that connection between development and historic preservation. But before I came here, there had been an historic preservation movement, obviously, in the 1970s that had defined, because of the Cape May, probably the Cape May thing had happened, and Bridgeton said, "Oh, we've got better stuff than Cape May, and why should we waste it?" So there was a big movement in the 1970s, long before I came, to establish the historicity of Bridgeton, and so they had the same historicized Cape May was invited to come to Bridgeton to declare an historic district in Bridgeton. And I often reflect on the history of that actual activity. The architect, the historic architect or the architectural historian, I should say, who did the survey, I used to say, I went on until they told me to stop. And they finally, after naming 2,000 properties to the historic district, told them to stop.
So is it by property, or is it by geographic space, or is it?
Well, it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
There are whole neighborhoods that are on the historic list. So this neighborhood, for example, the one we're in right now, is essentially part of the historic district. But so is the downtown neighborhood. So is a section of the Pearl Street. So is the courthouse district. So there are, I think, 5 different sections of the very large historic district in Bridgeton, and they encompass these 2,000 properties.
I see. Is there a website that someone can go to see the list of properties?
The Chaba website actually has a map of the historic district on it. It doesn't, I'm not sure that it has a link to the actual list of historic properties, because the city has, of course, a list by address. It was on our old website. I don't know if it made it to our new website, but I hope so. In any case, I can send that to you.
Chaba, I think you have a new website. Is that a fairly new website?
Yes, we just updated our website.
I like it. It's very, very, very nice.
Thank you.
You note that Chaba is a laboratory for preservation for the people. Can you explain what that means, this idea of a people-centered preservation?
Oh, I love your asking that question. I'm so glad you did. Because, it's been a principle of my historic work that forgetting is more the practice of humankind than remembering. It's easier to forget because we move from generation to generation, and not all of the information that is gathered by any particular generation is passed on to the next generation. And of course, the next generation is very future-oriented rather than past-oriented and wants often to forget. So forgetting is more of the practice of sort of humanism than remembering. So the practice of remembering is as important, if not more important, so that we know where we come from and what principles we have been saving and savoring for generations that are valuable to pass on from one generation to another. This is just sort of the basis of my outlook on intergenerational history, that we need to remember rather than to forget. And often what we remember are things that are quite wonderful that we had allowed ourselves to forget. For example, the Underground Railroad work in Paterson had been largely forgotten, not by the Black community, was fiercely convinced that it should be saved. But as the business community moved on and they became more futuristic and let's tear this down and let's build something new, those histories became sidelined. So that practice of forgetting happened here as well. It's part of the, you might say, the tension that I experienced between public civic government and historic preservation, that I persist in remembering rather than forgetting, which is what community development really wants to do. Forget and build new and recreate rather than go back and read the stories of the past. So as an historian, of course, as a cultural historian, I'm determined to not let that happen completely. That is to say, I am also futuristic. I want some of the essential history of the past, and often that's people history. That's community activism. That's the efforts that people make that don't get registered in the next phase of government, let's say, that get forgotten. For example, we're working on the nail house right now. The nail house is the last remnant of an industrial cycle that Bridgeton, like Paterson, like other industrial cities, went through in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The city moved on from making nails and shaping iron goods. They developed a glass industry, and that too evolved and left Bridgeton, a city much like Paterson that is post-industrial. Now, the post-industrial aspect of Bridgeton is the sort of the wave of the future, right? But the industrial history of Bridgeton is the basis for the post-industrial history. You can't have one without the other. And I love that nexus between those two things, those two phases of history, that in Bridgeton's case, they tore down all the buildings that were associated with the nail industry, except the nail house. And at the time the nail industry left, the city, which was pretty progressive at the time, decided they would not just buy the buildings that buy back the area that the nail industry had impacted, but all the upland watershed that the nail industry still owned, with the raceway and the lakes and the trees and the walks in the woods and the river and so on, they would take that saved watershed, which had been the basis for the nail industry when it was a water power-based industry. They would rescue that saved watershed and turn it into a city park. To me, that is the narrative of modernism, basically, the post-industrial narrative, where you go from grunge, as I call it, from industrial grunge to green. And that is the aspect of the history of the nail house that we want to narrate, that we want to save, that we want to say is not just regressive, but progressive, that it represents a stage of not just Bridgeton history, but American history, but world history, actually, that is looking to the future as well as recognizing the importance of the past to that future. So that's what the nail house represents to us in Chaba, and why we are investing so much of our energy in rescuing it.
Well, and you, Chaba, received an award in 2021, a statewide preservation award for preservation innovation due to your book, which I understand began as a crowdsourcing script, right? This little building is huge.
Yes.
Book that you did. So the Cumberland Nail and Iron Works, the nail house, as we all refer to it as, you're right, has such a national tie.
Yes.
Earl and Smith, Farracute Machinery Company, all of that. And I see on your website you touch upon a lot.
Exactly.
But I don't know that a lot of people now recognize the really national significance of this. But you touched on something that I wanted to ask you about, and that is, And I think I know the answer to your question, but do you think that people are more invested or vested in the present and the future when they remember and honor the past? I mean, is that what this is all about?
Ask that question again.
Do you think that people can be more invested in the here and now if they remember and honor the past?
That's a really interesting way to put it. I think the answer is yes, because particularly in relation to industrial history, because American hegemony, you might say, its prominence in the world, on the world stage, arises from its industrial past. There is no American century, you might say, 20th century, no American century without industrial history, without the industry. And there still is a powerful basis in American strength from its industrial base. It's different now from what it used to be.
He's grunge to green. That's interesting to me because there are a lot of lessons that we've learned from industrial revolution, good and bad.
Yes.
But they've led us to where we are now.
Yes, and that ability of ours to transition into a new kind of industrial hegemony is going to be the touchstone of our success as a nation, I believe. So we can tell the entire story of America from the nail house, basically, if you want to know it. We can tell the local story, we can tell the wider local story, we can tell the regional story, and we can tell the national story.
Local history is national history.
That's right. All history is local, eventually.
Chaba has developed historic guidelines, translated them into Spanish, has a home fronts program. Can you describe, is this a boots on the ground program? Can you describe maybe more specifically what that all is about?
Well, we started out, because I was on the Historic District Commission to begin with, and we started out as an organization wanting very much to communicate to new communities who had moved into Bridgeton what historic preservation was about. And we felt it was essential to do that by making the text of the historic guidelines available to people who were Spanish speaking. So that was the motivation for translating the guidelines. I must say Maria Moreno is bilingual, of course, was very instrumental in that. She didn't do the translation herself. She had a colleague do it, but she did review it and made sure that it was accessible to the local community. So that was a really important phase of our evolution. The guidelines then, because they were the first in the state, and I couldn't find another one in the country, received an historic preservation award because they were communicating to new communities what was the importance of historic preservation in old communities. And to me and to us, that represented a bridge. You know, I often encounter very negative attitudes towards new immigration in this community. I have over the course of my time here. And, you know, families that had been here for generations looked upon the new immigration and the transition to a multilingual community as a downslide into some kind of, I don't know, negative pit of importance in the community. So that was a really, you might say I personally suffered through that because I am, just by nature, I feel as though I bridge cultural communities. My sister has just done her DNA. So I know how I bridge communities. You know, I'm Jewish, I'm Muslim, I'm Spanish, I'm French, I'm Italian, I'm Sicilian as well as Northern Italian. So, I mean, I've got it all, that whole Mediterranean basis in my bloodstream. And there isn't anything more historical than that. You know, that's where history begins. You know, I don't know if you've ever looked at a history of the world, you know, the development actually of the physical world, the geological history of the world. The Mediterranean basin was there at the beginning. As everything sort of evolved millions of years ago, the Mediterranean basin was the sort of the launching pad for the entire world histories.
Maybe it explains a lot for where you're coming from.
Yeah,
Right.
I think to some extent it does. But a lot of people, I live in a community of activists who come from many, many backgrounds, and still they share the passion for narrating, for scripting the landscape, for telling the stories, for saving the physical elements that tell that story, so that we can see it, so we can feel it, so we can touch it. So that is what I think drives our outreach into communities of all languages and cultures, because we want them to feel like they are invested too in the narrative that continues to support them. You asked me another question that had to do with translating the guidelines and so on. Maybe I missed something.
Well, I guess my question goes to, look, yeah, there's certainly a financial reality to owning and maintaining a home.
Exactly.
So the idea of not necessarily renovating, but preserving homes is costly. And it's hard, right? So what are those specific guidelines? What is this program hoping to achieve and help people maintain that integrity?
Right. Well, that's why we translated the guidelines, and why we have a short form of the guidelines that is in both languages that we actually distribute free of charge, and have asked the city to distribute to people who come in for approvals for their changes to homes. I don't know how activist the city government is in offering that opportunity to people who want to get approvals for their rehabs, but we make it available, and we make our services available to people who are homeowners free of charge, and to people who are in businesses for a small fee.
Is that like a consulting? So in other words, what can we do that will still maintain that integrity?
That's exactly right. I wish we had more people coming to us for that. We make it available. We have made the paperwork, the paper analysis of what we do, short form, as accessible as possible in 2 languages, available in the city. But we very seldom get people who turn to us and say, what can we do? But we do get them. Occasionally we get them. I would say maybe several times a year, somebody will turn to us and phone us and say, this is what we want to do. Can you help us to get that approval? So it does work, but it's simply not sufficiently fostered by the city itself to make it work better. I wish it were. I wish I could say that the people in the city government are more forthcoming about what's going on, that the district commission would invite us to help out applicants who might need help. I wish they were more activist in that regard, but they are not. We do have considerable support from the business administrator, Kevin Rebego. I'd like to give him a shout out, because he's very interested in what we do. He thinks that we are helpful. He does promote our services when the opportunity presents itself to him. But he's not down in the nitty-gritty of everyday encounters with people who want to make changes to their buildings. So he can't always interface with so directly as we would need to. And we are not getting the reverberation, the recommendation that often would serve us, as well as people who are now new homeowners or old homeowners who want to change their buildings into something that's more productive or more financially useful. So we're here. We're not as often tapped as we should be.
Having grown up in a Victorian house, I know how hard it can be to have
relevant to people who are in city government.
Right.
I think that's the real challenge. They see history as irrelevant. Past is the past and now is now. But we have seen so many really rich opportunities that have come through preservation. I have to resort to the Patterson experience, because I think that it represents a futuristic outlook very often that is an exemplar to the other communities. Hinchliffe Stadium which you may know as a stadium that was owned by the school system in Paterson, had a original history as a black baseball stadium. It was the only place in the New York area that, after the Black Yankees were evicted from Yankee Stadium, hosted black baseball in the 1930s and 40s and into the 50s. And it became a school stadium and began to degenerate as the school's budgets came apart. But I was on the Historic Preservation Commission at the time that a movement began to rescue it, and now it's a jewel of the community. The school system still owns it and conducts their services there and so on. But it has a baseball team. It has other activities that are sports related in it. It has a museum, which is a mecca for people who are interested in sports history, especially black baseball history, which is very, very current. And of course, it's the pride of the local community. So this can happen.
Well, the lesson is not to forget about what it was.
Not to forget,
many years, right?
And also to realize in more senses than one, not just to recognize, but to make real how history can be a driver of community development. That is the essence of the mission that I have in Chaba, that we have in Chaba, to encourage people to see that community development can begin at the roots of the historical communities that we own, and we should not lose them if they can still tell a story to the community of the present and the future. And Bridgeton has that possibility. It has that possibility in more ways than many communities in this state and many communities in the country.
Yeah, I've always said that Bridgeton is a microcosm for the country.
Yes, it is. And its cultural aspect is that microcosm. It retains that microcosm even now, but its many layered narrative about how the landscape was transformed into industry and then retransformed back into, like green space. That's the grunge to green story that's so important in America.
Speaking for just a few minutes specifically about Bridgeton's architectural range, as Chaba notes on its website, it's encyclopedic.
Yes.
Cabin to castle, high Victorian to classical revival to modernist. That's a quote from the website. And that's so true.
Yes.
There are so many different gems throughout the town from noted architects from many, spanning many decades. Can you describe for me some of your favorite properties in town that have been preserved?
Well, it is a challenge. There's no question that it's a challenge. And it's a challenge to convey to people that encyclopedic range. Because there are people who love Victorian architecture and just think that, well, that's all we should preserve. And there are people who are futuristic and like the more modernist and say, well, Bridgeton doesn't have enough of that. I find myself often in this sort of doublespeak thing that this world that I exist in, because I want to preserve the oldest house, the oldest buildings, and the newest, if possible. Those that at least make the standard of the National Register, that are at least 50 years old. Some of my favorites are the modernist ones, and they have been so mistreated in Bridgeton because they are modernist, because people think, oh no, this is a Victorian city, and so we can't, despoil the picture of Bridgeton by saving these, like modernist, intruders to the Victorian district. But they are not intrusions to me. They are representatives of the sort of cultural awareness that people have in Bridgeton. So there is a modernist house just down the street, which is often called the Frank Lloyd Wright House. Frank Lloyd Wright had nothing to do with it, but the architect who architected it obviously had been trained in that school, that Prairie Architecture School. And it's a wonderful example.
I've been in that home.
Yes, right?
Friend all through school, Randy Fishman, Dr. and Mrs. Fishman. I've been in that house many.
Yes, I know. I've talked to Dr. Fishman about it. it so galls me that the people who moved into it, they may love the house, but they didn't realize that the landscaping is as important to the house as the house, because the Prairie School is nature and culture together. And so those trees that obscured the house from the street, because after all, the architect knew this was a Victorian neighborhood, and he deliberately obscured this modernist house in order not to obstruct the perspective on the Victorian neighborhood, that the trees were protecting that house from being an architectural, distraction, sore thumb, so to speak, even though it was a beautiful house in its own architectural way. So when they took down the trees, I wept.
They served a purpose.
Yeah,
right?
They served an architectural purpose, and the Historic District Commission should have not let them do that. There's another modernist building. I had a tangle with the head of the District Commission about it on the corner of, names are beginning to escape me. This is my problem as I age. The corner next to the hospital, Irving Avenue and Mannheim Avenue. It was designed by a modernist Philadelphia architect. It was a 1970s, probably a late 1960s, early 1970s building. Another sort of modernist gem. I saw that they were renovating it, and I had a conversation with the head of the Historic District Commission about it. Well, it's not included in the historic district literature, and blah, 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 he went on. You might want to cut that out. But so how can we protect it? Blah, blah, blah. I said, just make sure that they don't destroy it. That's all I'm asking.
Well, you're passionate about this.
About architecture, but I'm also passionate about recognizing that Bridgeton went through a transitional phase that said we are interested in architecture, not necessarily in history, but we are interested in architecture as well as in history. Let's put it that way.
And they're tied together.
And they, of course, are tied together by the built environment, but that was a phase of the cultural self-recognition of Bridgeton that, even if it doesn't meet the standards of the National Register, should be recognized. It's Bridgeton history. It's local concern about architecture. It's the passion for architecture that is being represented in those buildings. And I think they are just as important as the Victorian buildings in this community. And I don't care if they don't meet some obligatory standard for the hearings that have to be held. You still hold them in your mind and your heart, and you try to effect some kind of dialogue about preserving them to the people who are renovating them. If you are interested in historic preservation, that's what you do. Even you don't always stay within the lines. You don't always color within the lines. You exceed the color within the lines objective sometimes. And I guess that's what makes me a preservationist with a difference. Why I irritate people, because I often want to color outside the lines.
That's okay. That's okay. That's how change gets made.
Yeah. And I am interested, of course, in change. Cultural change is my business. So I'm interested in how people interact with their own environments and experience them. Why I want to so much to take young people from the high school, have tours, have them participate in activities that are related to the cultural environment. So it's very important. That's why I thought it was important to tell the story in Spanish as well as English.
The book.
Yeah.
And the guidelines.
Yes,
that's right.
And basically to honor the culture that is the culture of the future here, which is a bilingual culture, as well as the culture of the past.
It's interesting to me that you and Sandy had an experience just outside this home.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Can you explain what happens with the
I'd love to.
wall? Because to me, that's you saw firsthand.
Yes, the two walls on either side of Commerce Street, just beyond the bridge, are the investment of the city, perhaps, from what I've gathered in the historicity of the landscape. They were investment in the city in supporting the Union effort in the Civil War. That was when Oberlin Smith actually moved out of the Cumberland Nail and Iron Works and started his own business, because the first thing he made were tin lunch pails for the army, for the Union Army. But the city needed to get where it was going fast, and where it was going was Greenwich. Way to Greenwich from the nail industry, from the nail mill, was circuitous. You know, it had to go up Atlantic Street and down Broad and then out to Greenwich, you know, by a circuitous route. They found that the Commerce Street route, which they had always wanted to develop anyway, would have been made much more sense and made the progress of the trucks and so on faster. So my guess, because I have not found the actual documents to support it, my guess is that during the Civil War, they were able to bypass all protests by people here in Cohansey, because this is the section called Cohansey Township, to vote all of those interests to preserve the distance between the Bridgeton city, multicultural, smoky, industrial city, and this well-heeled landscape on the cliff, that they were able to plow through that literally as well as figuratively, plow through the objections of the Cohansey Township and build the road through the bluff. They took out, I think, if I remember correctly, more than 25,000 cubic feet of earth out of that space and plowed a road through, and of course had to build some kind of bulwark against the degradation of those properties that were confronting the road by building these walls. And,
right at your doorstep.
Yeah, right out our doorstep. So they built a sandstone wall here first, which was easy enough to build. And then as time went on, they built a granite wall on the other side. And it made financial good sense at the time. But the 150-year-old wall began to deteriorate, with the roots leaking rain through the wall and through the mortar and so on. And one morning, a city official came to our door and said, "You better clean up the road, the sidewalk in front of your property, because, we're going to start fining you." And we walked outside our door and found this pile of earth, like 20 feet deep, in front of our property.
Which is scary, because were you concerned about it ultimately potentially affecting the structural integrity of the home or the land that this house is on?
Sure, it is distance enough from the house not to immediately affect us. But of course, the property is a beautiful property, and it was obviously impacting a very, not just beautiful piece of earth, but a very historic piece of it. And we wanted to rebuild. There was no question about it. But it was going to be very, very expensive. And I'm sorry that we don't have the book to show you. The engineer who helped us, who was godsend to us, was very important, but he also kept a very...
Who was that engineer? Put you on the spot. That's okay. It'll come.
That my brain is losing names. It was always a problem with my memory to remember names, but now it's getting worse. It's Jeff, what is his last name?
Well, don't think about it, and it'll come back to you, right?
Oh, my God. Sandy's going to be so embarrassed, and Jeff is going to be like, how could you?
Ultimately, you were able to...
Yes. God damn it. Excuse me. Let me think for a minute. Why? I'm blanking on his last name. I just can't believe. But he is... He's an engineer. He happened to be selling his house on Lake Street at the time, and still here, preparing his house for sale. And thank God, because he's now moved to Philadelphia. The collapse had happened before he moved. After he moved out, we would not have had his support. So he was the linchpin support for us there. It saved us a lot of engineering study money, because the city needed to see that we were going to rebuild it in a way that was safe. And so we had to build concrete and steel back to the new wall, and then refill the area that had collapsed, and rebuild the wall to matching the original.
How long did that take?
It took from 2022 about 3 years.
Okay.
almost 4
And
years.
I recall riding up and down and seeing the scaffolding and the work that was being done. But that gave you kind of a firsthand experience. I mean, you had lived in older homes your whole life, but gave you a firsthand experience of what it takes to be able to keep that restored.
Yes, and of course we had always considered it an important feature of the house, that wall. The
historical significance.
Not just the historical significance, but of course the landscape significance of it.
Right.
And the property that we're in right now is related to the Shepherd House. The family, the Shepherds, also lived here. Granddaughter of the builder of the Shepherd House lived here and raised her family. And when the Shepherd House became a school, the two of the teachers at the Shepherd House, the girls' school that became Ivy Hall, lived here. So there was often a lot of activity on this property that was related to the very important history of the Shepherd House as Ivy Hall. Girls used to probably recreate on this property, as well as on the property of the Shepherd House itself. It was much more ample, and they could dance and sing and play games up here the way they could not down
if only the walls could talk.
If only walls could talk. But they do, you find as we uncovered as we rebuilt the earthworks that supported that wall, we found objects in it that were related to the historic story of Bridgeton, both the iron mill and the Shepherd House history as a school. There are artifacts, actually, that contain some of that history. I have to add this element to that story. It was not just the engineer who helped us. It was the Mexican community that did, because they brought with them to Bridgeton their skill sets as builders. They knew how to do concrete. They knew how to do stonework. They knew how to use those old stones and place them into the wall and cement them into the wall in a way that was correct and that would last. If it had not been for the Mexican community, that wall would not exist. So I want that to be an important part of the conversation that you communicate through this narrative, that we are now bonded inextricably to the Mexican community by that wall.
Well, that's amazing.
Yes. And they are also across the street, I might add, because that wall began to collapse. That granite wall began to collapse. And now they're refurbishing it. And if it were not also for the skill sets of the builder community in Bridgeton and in this area, who are largely immigrants, we would not be able to do that.
They are now part of the history of the wall.
They are indeed part of the history of the wall. Wow. Thank you.
I want to just speak for a couple minutes before we end this conversation, and I could speak with you all afternoon. But this idea of life of academia versus a life of action, right?
That's
and so you are an academic. You have been for decades. And I think a lot of people think it's one or the other. So you seem to live in both areas, both worlds, life of academia, life of action. Can you speak to that?
What a lovely question. I really appreciate that question. There is a bridge between them. In fact, I often find myself resorting to the historians who were also activists. I am now reading, for example, the work of B.E.B. Du Bois on the history of the Reconstruction. It's, first of all, of course, very illuminating about how the book I'm reading is called Black Reconstruction in America. So it integrates the history of Reconstruction more widely and concentrates on how African Americans were brought into the American cultural landscape through Reconstruction. W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, was also an activist, brilliant historian, very, very credentialed historian, but also was active in the political world. And so was my late husband, Henry J. Brown, a labor historian who was also very active in the civil rights movement, and then, of course, became an activist in the Patterson community before he died. I am sort of attracted to historians who feel a responsibility to carry their wisdom and their knowledge into the real world. I guess my own historical background and my interest in how it impacts immediate, lived culture was one of the things that attracted me to Harry Browne in the first place, because that was his shtick. And that's why we were such a great team in Paterson until he died. In some ways, my relationship with my present husband, Edward Fedema, is based on that same kind of intersection. He is very interested in the texture of culture, the texture history of things, how material culture, you might say. He's not an anthropologist. He has no degree, but he knows how material culture tells the story of the past. So that is a common ground we have. And of course, his work, which is to buy and sell and trade objects in material culture, is a very present activity that goes on in our household. So I feel as though I have been always attracted to that world, that history that lives in things, that lives in the landscape, that lives in the texture of our environment, that lives immediately in our present. I can't escape it. It's just been part of you might say, the landscape of my own life. I was once asked by a community group what attracted me in the first place to historic preservation. And I thought back to my girlhood. I grew up in New Rochelle, New York, which is an historic city in itself. The founders were escapees from the prejudices against activists and sort of Protestant activists in the world. And they had churches in New Rochelle. It was sort of this French community that founded New Rochelle from La Rochelle in France. And they had a cemetery where they buried people from the 17th century and 18th. State put the road 95 thruway through New Rochelle. They didn't care. They plowed it right through that cemetery. There was no historic preservation movement at the time to protest.
I bet that bothered you as a little girl.
Oh my God, I was a teenager.
Yeah.
I was a teenager and it bothered me. So it must have been something in my makeup that just resisted that kind of violation of the historic landscape. So it wasn't long before I, found places to exercise that same intersection of the historic landscape with present activism. And I've just followed it at that path through my whole life.
Yeah. So do you think that idea of a life of action, activism, yes. Is that the secret to a meaningful life?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Putting your words into action?
Well, I don't think it's the only secret to a meaningful life, but it is certainly a secret to mine. If it's a secret, it's important in my life. And it probably would be interesting, that you've raised that question of culture as medicine, so to speak, culture as the cure for what ails you. Yeah, I think it is a way for academics like me, intellectuals like me, to feel as though my life is relevant to the present. Why not? I mean, you don't have to be an academic or a cultural historian to do what I do. Not all of the participants in our Chaba are academics or historians, but it certainly helps. And it helps in terms of leadership, I suppose, because I have this. It's not just my interest in Bridgeton. It's not just my interest in Paterson or my sort of local community service desire to serve the community that drives me. It is a much bigger, more comprehensive sort of motivation, sort of inner, that defines my personality, that defines my objective in life, to connect the real and the existent with what we remember or what we forget. I think that's probably one of the driving forces in my intellectual life is, I think I've mentioned that forgetting is more of a human activity than remembering. And I'm sort of anti-forgetting. And that's my academic life, and that's my activist life at the same time. Has that answered your question?
It does. It does. So if this conversation strikes a forward with anyone who is listening, what would you suggest that they do?
Call me. I would love to enlarge our board. I would love to enlarge the skill set. We have people who are invested in practical work of rebuilding. Maggie DeMarco, for example, is a skilled carpenter. Alan Meyer has really good with his hands. He's a builder as well as an engineer. They're both actually degreed engineers, but they like hands-on kind of activities. We consist of people who are intellectuals, who are activists, who are interested in carpentry, who are interested in preservation, both in historic and a physical activity. It is a wonderful field if you bridge that kind of the intellectual and the physical and the practical.
Well, you have a new website, as we mentioned, and I will link it to this interview, but it is centerchabarts.org. And so I would invite all of our listeners to go onto the website and read more about everything.
By the way, the HAB part is like a marker. There is a program at the National Parks level, which is called HABS, which is Historic American Buildings.
I see.
And that is why I preserved those initials in the center of the name.
I see.
Because I wanted for people to realize that it's habitat that is being acknowledged in the HAB part, and the Center on Arts parts are just sort of tags along with the habitat part. Habitat is the most crucial element of the work we do. It is the part of it that recognizes the humanity and the humanism of the work we do.
Well, the Bridgeton Beacon would love to continue to shine a spotlight on all that you and everyone that's working with Chaba has done and continue to do, really to help honor the past so that we can appreciate the present and the future, as you've said, help script that landscape and help focus on why local history really is national history.
And international. It is human history. Local history is human history. That's really important. Thank you very, very much for allowing me this time to speak my truth, so to speak.
Thank you very much, and I hope we can speak again very soon.
Thank you.